Hi everyone, my name is Trevor and I'll be presenting our paper, Rigid Body Dynamics Estimation by Unscented Filtering Closed Estimation Neural Networks. So the authors of this paper are myself and my advisor, Kristi A. Morgansen. So the motivation of this paper is based on the fact that over the past several years, there have been huge advances in using deep neural networks for image processing tasks. So the biggest application has been object classification, where you determine which objects appear in an image. But over the past few years, people have also been using deep neural networks to do object pose estimation, which is where you determine the position and orientation of an object in the image. And so this video is from work done in 2018, where they developed a pose estimation neural network. And you can see that the results are pretty good, except they're not perfect. You can see that some of the estimates are a little bit twitchy. And specifically, if you look at the yellow mustard bottle, you can see that there are poses for which the estimates are pretty bad. So in this paper, we'll consider an object with rigid body dynamics. So specifically, we'll consider our object of interest to be a soup can. And so based on a video of this object along a trajectory, we'll feed each frame of the video into the neural network to get an estimate of position and orientation. And those estimates won't be perfect. So we'll then implement an unscented filter based on the dynamics of the object in order to improve the estimates. So the concept of this paper can be summarized by this diagram, where we have an image being input into a neural network, which outputs a pose estimate. So we can consider the neural network to be analogous to a sensor. And so the pose estimate will get fed into the unscented filter, which will produce a state and covariance estimate, and then we'll iterate through each frame of the video. So the state of the filter will be the object's position, orientation, and the corresponding velocities. And so the position is easy to incorporate into the state vector, but the rotation is not as easy due to the manifold nature of rotation matrices. So there are a lot of different attitude parameterizations like quaternions and Euler angles. Any parameterization is going to require modifications to be made to the unscented filter. And so in this paper, we parameterize rotation using the tangent space of the group of rotation matrices. So this parameterization is also sometimes called exponential coordinates, and it also corresponds to an axis angle representation where you have a unit length axis times the angle of rotation. So we let lowercase s denote our rotational parameters, and capital S denote the corresponding skew symmetric matrix. And so we'll use both lowercase and capital S to refer to the rotational parameters in the filter. And so we'll often need to convert from the rotational parameters S to a rotation matrix and vice versa. And so we do that using the exponential and logarithmic maps shown here. And at each iteration of the filter, we'll keep track of the current estimate of rotation using the matrix R hat. And then we'll let the rotational parameters S represent offsets from the coordinate frame of R hat. So now we can define our state space formulation. Our state X will consist of the position P, orientation S, translational velocity P dot, and rotational velocity omega. Our measurement Y, which comes from the neural network, will consist of the position P and orientation S. So lastly, we need to define the measurement functions and how the noise enters the measurement functions. So recall that the measurement comes from a neural network, which is a very complex and nonlinear function. So the noise is going to depend on a lot of factors like the appearance of the object, the lighting, the background, and also how the network was trained. So instead of trying to precisely characterize the noise in the network, we're going to use a simple and generic model to try to capture the noise as a whole. So we define our measurement of position to be h sub p, which is the true position plus some noise v sub p, and our measurement of rotation to be h sub r, which is the true rotation r times the exponential of some noise v sub s. And then we define our measurement noise vector as V, which consists of the noise in the position and noise in the rotation. So now we can define our unscented filter. So I don't have time to go through every step, but it's mostly a standard unscented filter. So there are several notes here, notes 1, 2, 3, and 4, which describe modifications we've had to make to the filter in order to incorporate our parameterization of rotation. And so these notes mostly just involve converting between the rotational parameters S and a rotation matrix R, and vice versa. And so I'll also mention that there are several different versions of the unscented filter. In this paper, we use the version where we augment the state X with the process noise W and measurement noise V to create an augmented state chi. So in order to implement the unscented filter, we need video of a rigid body. So instead of getting this video experimentally, we use a image rendering environment. Specifically, we use the open source program Blender to generate photorealistic images of the object. With Blender, we can precisely control the position and orientation of the object, as well as things like lighting and background. And we can also generate a lot of images in a short amount of time. And so the specific pose estimation network we use is called DOPE, which is the network I showed on the first slide. And we chose this network because it works well and the authors provided good code for it online. So before we implement the filter, we're first going to characterize the noise in the network a little bit. So we start by considering a 1D example where we take the object and move it from left to right in the image. We take each image, feed it through the neural network to get an estimate of position, and then find the bias, which is plotted on the right. And so we can see that the bias is on average about 0 mean, but it does have this sort of state dependence where it's positively biased on the left-hand side and negatively biased on the right-hand side. And so this is disadvantageous for filtering because ideally we'd want the bias to be more uniformly distributed around 0. So then we did the same experiment, but in the Y and Z directions as well. And we can see that we also have this similar state-dependent bias behavior, which we saw in the X direction. We then did a similar experiment where we rotated the object around the X, Y, and Z axes and calculated the bias in rotation. And so we can see that in this case, the bias is a little bit more uniformly distributed around 0. And we saw in our simulations that the filter was able to improve the estimates of rotation more than the estimates of translation. And we believe this behavior is one reason why. So in order to implement the unscented filter, we need the mean and covariance of the measurement noise. In order to determine that, we considered specific environments characterized by certain lighting conditions and background colors. So for each environment, we generated 1,000 random images and then fed those images through the network and then calculated the sample mean and covariance using the equations on the right. And so this gives us this measurement noise covariance matrix PVV, which is what we used in the unscented filter in our simulations. So now we can show the simulation. So we have the raw video on the left, the network estimate in the middle, and the filter estimate on the right. And it may not be completely obvious from the video, but the filter generally improves the position and orientation estimates. Specifically, there's a pretty bad estimate in the middle of the trajectory that the network makes, but the filter is able to smooth that out. So this is probably more obvious if we look at a plot. So in the top right, the position area is plotted. So the neural network has an average error throughout the trajectory of 3.7, and the filter has an average error of 2.8. And so in particular, we can see that the filter does a good job of smoothing out the large spikes in error, which we can see one a little after 0.1 seconds. And then on the bottom right is the rotation error. And we see that in this case, the filter does an even better job of improving the accuracy and cuts the error in about half. We can also plot the 3 sigma bounds based on the covariance matrix from the filter. So we see that the position errors and the rotation errors both stay between the 3 sigma bounds. So the neural network provides measurements of only the position and orientation, but since we're filtering the full dynamics of the object, we get velocity estimates as well. So we can see that the translational velocity errors converge down to below about 10 centimeters per second, and the rotational velocity errors converge down to below about 20 degrees per second. So that just shows one simulation. So the last thing we did was rerun the same simulation 100 times, but with different initial orientations. And so based on an average over each trajectory, we found that the filter improves the position estimate for 83% of the simulations and improves the orientation estimate for 85% of the simulations. So that's the end of the talk. We'd like to thank Unscented for his insights into rigid body dynamics, and Mohammed Abdul Makit for providing some example code to use the DOPE network in Python. And finally, we've posted our code online on GitHub if you want to check it out. So thanks for watching, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.